All four of you come in." Boone Carter had heard many things in his 32 years. He'd heard the rattle of a snake just before it strikes. He'd heard the whisper of a dying man asking for water. He'd heard the silence of a town that had given up all hope. But he had never, ever heard words like those. Not spoken in perfect, clear English. Not from a woman who had no business being there, and definitely not from inside a cabin that was supposed to be a tomb. He sat dead still on his horse, the leather of the saddle creaking softly under his weight. His eyes were locked on the thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin's stone chimney. The smoke was wrong. In this cold, damp air, it should have been thick and white. This smoke was thin, almost nervous, like it was trying not to be seen. Everything about this place was wrong. This was the old Miller cabin. The Millers had died of fever 3 winters back. Everyone knew that. The place had been picked clean by scavengers and then left to the wind and the wolves. But someone had swept the porch. He could see the faint lines from a broom in the dirt. Someone had nailed a new piece of wood over the broken shutter, and someone was cooking inside. The smell of stew, faint but undeniable, drifted on the wind. The voice came again, and this time it sent a shiver straight down his spine. "You can come closer. They won't run if you move slowly." The children. His gaze snapped to the woodpile stacked against the side of the cabin. And there they were. 3 small shapes, huddled together like frightened quail. He could just make out their dirty faces, their eyes wide and ancient, peering out at him from the shadows. Children. Hiding. But why wasn't she hiding with them? And how in the hell did she know he was even there? He hadn't made a sound. He'd been riding this land since he was a boy, taught by his father to move like a ghost. His horse's hooves were silent on the soft pine-needle-covered earth. He'd come in from downwind, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. No one should have known he was there. No one could have known, unless she wasn't just in the cabin, unless she'd been waiting for him. The heavy wooden door creaked open, just a few inches at first, and then wider. What Boone saw made his blood turn to ice in his veins, not because of who it was, but because of what it meant. It was an Apache woman. Her hair was long and black, braided down her back, and woven into those braids were strips of dyed leather. Strips he recognized. Strips he had seen 100 times before. They were from a belt that belonged to Jonathan Whitman, the Whitman family. They'd vanished 2 months ago, leaving behind nothing but a cold farmhouse and a reward poster that was now faded and peeling in the general store. The woman looked right at him. Her eyes held no surprise. They held no fear. They held only a deep, terrible sadness, a knowing that seemed older than the mountains themselves. "I've been waiting for you, Boone Carter," she said. His mind reeled. He'd never laid eyes on this woman in his entire life. How could she possibly know his name? How could she know he'd be here, at this exact moment, at this forgotten cabin? His hand, acting on pure instinct, moved toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. But he stopped. The woman hadn't made a single threatening move. She just stood there, her hands open and visible at her sides, watching him with an expression that was almost relieved. "How do you know my name?" His voice was a low growl, rougher than he'd intended. "Word travels," she said simply. "A cowboy who asks too many questions about a missing family. People talk." She stepped aside, gesturing with her head toward the dark interior of the cabin. It was surprisingly clean. A small fire crackled in the hearth, a pot bubbling over it. "The children are hungry," she said. "They've been hiding since the sun came up." Boone's gaze flickered back to the woodpile. The 3 small faces were still there, watching his every move. The oldest, a boy of maybe 8, had pushed the 2 younger ones behind him, trying to shield them with his small body. They were all wearing clothes that were little more than patched-up rags, but they were clean. It was a detail that didn't fit. Nothing about this fit. "Whose children are they?" he asked, though a cold dread was already starting to form in his gut. That, she said, her dark eyes never leaving his, is what we need to talk about. But not out here. Sheriff Morrison's men have been riding this way. They'll be back before the sun sets. Morrison. The name was like a foul taste in his mouth. Sheriff Morrison had a special kind of hatred for the Apache. He'd been looking for any excuse, any reason at all to drive them from these lands for good. If he found an Apache woman here, alone, with 3 white children. The thought was too ugly to complete. "You're putting them in danger just by being here," Boone said, his voice hard. "I'm keeping them alive," she shot back, a sudden fire in her eyes. "Those children you see, their names are Tommy, Lily, and Samuel. They have been with me for 6 long weeks. Before that, they were alone, starving in the ashes of their own home." The pieces of the puzzle began to slam together in Boone's mind, forming a picture so horrible he didn't want to look at it. A burned homestead, a missing family, 3 children left for dead. But it didn't make sense. "The Whitman place burned down 2 months ago," he said, thinking out loud. "Morrison's report said there were no survivors. Morrison's report was a lie." She took a step closer, and now he could see the leather strips in her hair clearly. They weren't trophies of war, as some might have assumed. They were worn as bands of mourning. He was wrong about a great many things. From behind the woodpile, the boy, Tommy, whispered something urgent to the 2 little ones. They looked terrified, but not of Boone. Their eyes kept darting past him, toward the main trail, toward the direction from which Morrison's men would come. They weren't scared of him. They were scared of the law. "Why me?" Boone asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since she spoke his name. "Why were you waiting for me?" The Apache woman was silent for a long moment, the weight of her secret heavy in the air between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Because you were the only one who went to the Whitman grave after the burial, the only one who left flowers. You're the only one who might actually care what truly happened to their children." And then a sound cut through the quiet woods, faint but growing stronger. Hoofbeats, more than one horse, and they were coming this way. The woman's face drained of all color. "They're early," she whispered, her eyes wide with a new, sharp fear. "Boone Carter, in the next 5 minutes you are going to have to decide what kind of man you really are." The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. A steady, rhythmic pounding that sounded like a death knell. Boone could count them now, at least 3 horses, moving at a hard pace. They'd be on top of the cabin in minutes. There was no time to think, only to act. "Get the children inside," he said, his voice a low command. "Now." The Apache woman didn't hesitate. She gave a soft, bird-like whistle, and the 3 children scurried from behind the woodpile like startled mice. They ran for the cabin door, the boy Tommy holding the hands of the 2 smaller ones, pulling them along with a grim efficiency that no child should possess. "Wait!" Boone held up a hand just as they reached the threshold. He dismounted in one fluid motion and knelt down, bringing himself to their level. He looked at the youngest, a little boy named Samuel, whose wide blue eyes stared up at him, a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate hope. "You're the Whitman children." It wasn't a question. Now that they were close, the resemblance was a punch to the gut. Tommy had his father's stubborn jawline. Lily, the little girl, had her mother's delicate nose and ears. And Samuel had the unmistakable cleft in his chin that was a Whitman family trademark. "Their parents died trying to save them," the woman said from the doorway. "I found them 3 days after the fire. Tommy was feeding his brother and sister a soup he'd made from tree bark, trying to keep them alive." The approaching horses were nearly upon them. The jingle of spurs and bits carried on the wind. Boone made a decision that would tear his solitary life apart at the seams. "My name is Boone Carter," he said to Tommy, his voice softer now. Your father, Jonathan, and we traded horses once. He was a good man. You look just like him. For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear crossed the boy's face. Recognition. And then his eyes filled with tears. Tears he had clearly been holding back for weeks, for a lifetime. Can you take us home? A tiny voice whispered. It was Lily. Her plea was so small, so broken, it nearly shattered Boone's heart. There was no home. Their home was a pile of black ash and bitter memories. Before he could find the words to answer, the Apache woman touched his arm. Her name is Ayanna, Tommy said suddenly, his voice finding a surprising strength. She saved us. She's been taking care of us, but the bad men keep trying to hurt her. Ayanna. He knew enough of the Apache language to know what it meant. Eternal blossom, a name of hope and resilience. She had trusted these children with her true name, not some false one she'd give to the authorities. She had trusted them completely. The hoofbeats stopped abruptly just outside the cabin. 3 men dismounted, their spurs ringing like funeral bells in the sudden silence. Stay calm, Ayanna whispered to the children. Remember what we practiced. Practiced? What in God's name had she been practicing with these children? A heavy fist hammered on the door, making the old wood shudder. Open up! Sheriff's business! Boone knew that voice. It was Deputy Frank Miller, Morrison's favorite dog, a man who preferred to let his fists do the talking, a man who saw every Apache as a target. Ayanna looked at Boone, her eyes pleading. Please, she breathed. They are just children. Another thunderous knock, harder this time. We know you're in there. Open this door or we're breaking it down. Tommy, all of 8 years old, stepped in front of his younger siblings, his small body a defiant shield. He had been doing this for weeks. He was a boy carrying the weight of a man. Boone straightened up, his hand resting on the worn leather grip of his Colt. He hoped to God he wouldn't have to use it. He had seconds, maybe less, to figure out how to play this. Just as his hand reached for the door latch, Ayanna grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. There's something else, she whispered urgently, her words a frantic rush. You need to know why the Whitmans really died, and why Sheriff Morrison can't afford to have anyone find these children alive. The door shook again under a violent blow. Boone put a finger to his lips, signaling silence. He took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped outside, pulling the door firmly shut behind him, leaving the children and their secret hidden in the shadows. Deputy Frank Miller stood on the porch, flanked by 2 other men. All 3 wore the cheap tin stars that Sheriff Morrison handed out to any brute willing to do his dirty work. Miller's face was flushed, a blotchy red that spoke of anger and something else, something that looked a lot like fear. Afternoon, Frank, Boone said, his voice dangerously calm. What brings you boys so far off the main trail? Don't you play games with me, Carter, Miller snarled. We saw smoke. Someone's been squatting in this cabin, and we aim to find out who. Place looks empty to me, Boone replied, keeping his stance relaxed, his hand hovering just an inch from his gun. Maybe you boys saw the smoke from my campfire. I was just resting my horse. Miller wasn't buying it. He shoved past Boone, his hand reaching for the cabin door. Step aside, we're searching the place. Boone moved, blocking his path. On whose authority? Sheriff Morrison's authority, Miller spat. We got reports of Apache raiders in the area, stealing food from the settlements. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The only people going hungry in these parts were the Apache families whose winter stores Morrison had been burning under the guise of clearing out hostiles. Funny, Boone said, a cold edge to his voice. I heard the food shortages only started after Morrison began burning Apache supplies. Hard for folks to feed their children when their food is turned to ash. Miller's eyes narrowed into tiny, hateful slits. You taking their side now, Carter? Taking the side of savages? The word hit Boone like a physical blow. From inside the cabin, he heard a small, muffled sob. Lily. Tommy was probably holding his hand over her mouth, trying to keep her quiet, trying to be the man of the family once again. "I'm taking the side of children who need protecting," Boone said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet rumble. "What children?" Miller took a step closer, his own voice sinking to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know something about them Whitman kids?" And there it was, the confirmation of Boone's darkest fear. This wasn't about stolen food. This wasn't about Apache raiders. Morrison was hunting for the Whitman children specifically. "Why would Morrison care about children who died in a fire?" Boone asked, choosing his words with surgical precision. Miller's face went pale. He had said too much. He had revealed the secret that was eating him alive. "Because they ain't dead," one of the other deputies, a nervous young man named Peters, blurted out. "Morrison said they could identify." "Shut your mouth, Peters," Miller snapped, but the damage was done. The truth was out in the open, raw and ugly. The Whitman children were alive, and they had seen something that Sheriff Morrison would kill to keep buried. Inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked loudly. Then came Ayanna's voice, a desperate, muffled cry. "Tommy! No!" The cabin door flew open, and Tommy Whitman stepped out into the harsh afternoon light. The 8-year-old boy stood tall, his chin held high, and looked up at the 3 armed men with eyes that held no fear, only a cold, hard determination. "My name is Thomas James Whitman," he said, his voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent woods. "My father was Jonathan Whitman, my mother was Sarah Whitman, and I saw exactly who killed them." Miller's hand shot toward his gun. "The night our house burned," Tommy continued, his voice never wavering. "It wasn't Apache raiders who came. It was Sheriff Morrison, him and 5 of his men. They made us watch. They shot my parents. And then they set our home on fire and left us to die." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the chirping of a distant bird. Miller's gun was halfway out of its holster before Boone's hand shot out, clamping down on the deputy's wrist like a steel trap. "I wouldn't do that, Frank," Boone said, his voice soft as death. But Tommy wasn't finished. He had been holding this truth inside for 2 months, and now it was pouring out of him like a flood. "They were looking for something, papers my pa kept hidden in the root cellar. They found the box, but they didn't know we were there. They didn't know we saw everything." Miller ripped his hand free from Boone's grip, his face a twisted mask of pure panic and rage. "You lying little—" "Frank." Boone's voice cut through the air like a razor. "Draw that gun, and you'll answer to me." The deputy froze. Boone Carter's reputation with a pistol was the stuff of legend, a fact that even Morrison's thugs respected. But Miller was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are reckless. "The boy's talking crazy," he stammered. "That Apache woman, she must have filled his head with lies." "No lies," Tommy said, his small voice firm as a rock. I remember everything. Sheriff Morrison shot my paw first. Then he shot my ma when she tried to run to him. I heard him tell his men to make it look like an Apache raid. I heard him talking about land deeds, and about a man named Fletcher, who was buying up all the territory for cheap. Miller's face turned the color of bone. The name Fletcher had landed like a cannonball. Peters, the deputy who had already said too much, began backing away toward his horse. "Frank, maybe we should finish what the sheriff started," Miller snarled, his eyes darting around wildly. He was doing the math. 3 of them against 1 cowboy, and a woman and 3 children. The odds seemed to be in his favor. But then the cabin door opened wider. Ayanna stepped out, her hands held open and empty, but her eyes blazed with a fire that could melt steel. Behind her, Lily and Samuel clung to her dress, their small faces pale with terror. "These children have seen enough," Ayanna said, her voice low and steady. "Haven't you taken enough from them already?" "Shut your mouth, squaw," Miller spat. "You're all coming with us. The sheriff will figure out what to do with you." And that's when Boone Carter made the choice that would define the rest of his days. "No," he said simply. "They're not going anywhere." Miller let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You? Against the three of us? You ain't that good, Carter." "Maybe not." Boone's hand hung loose and ready by his side, his body shifting into the relaxed, balanced stance of a man who has faced death before and walked away. "But I don't have to be good. I just have to be faster than you." The silence stretched, pulled taut like a wire. Boone could hear the blood pounding in his ears. He could smell the sour scent of fear coming off Miller and his men. These weren't gunfighters. They were bullies, used to pushing around unarmed farmers and frightened Apache families. They weren't ready for this. "Besides," Boone continued, his tone almost conversational, "you boys seem to have forgotten something important." "And what's that?" Miller demanded, his hand twitching over the butt of his gun. "I'm not the only one listening to this conversation." Miller's eyes shot wide as he finally heard it. The sound Boone had noticed minutes ago, a sound his finely tuned senses had picked up and filed away. More horses, coming from the opposite direction. And they weren't moving with the frantic, aggressive pace of Morrison's men. These riders were taking their time. They were locals. "Sounds like the Henderson brothers coming back from town," Boone said casually, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Good. Church-going men, the Hendersons. I bet they'll be mighty interested to hear how their sheriff has been murdering innocent families for land deeds." Peters didn't need to hear another word. He was already scrambling onto his horse. "Frank, we gotta go. Now." Miller's hand trembled over his gun for one last agonizing second. But the approaching hoofbeats were getting louder, unmistakable now. If Boone was right, if it was the Hendersons, there could be no witnesses to what he was about to do. He couldn't risk it. "This ain't over, Carter," he growled, his voice thick with venom. "Yes," Boone replied, his voice as cold and final as a grave. "It is. From this moment on, these children are under my protection, and anyone who wants to hurt them will have to go through me first." As Miller and his remaining man mounted up and galloped away, their dust trail a plume of cowardice, Boone turned to face the small family behind him. Tommy stood a little taller, his shoulders squared with a newfound hope. Lily had stopped crying. Samuel was looking up at the tall cowboy with something akin to worship in his young eyes. And Ayanna was watching him with a look that was a mixture of profound gratitude and something else, something much deeper. "You have just made enemies of very dangerous men," she said softly. "I've had worse," Boone replied. He then looked down at the three children who had lost everything, at the woman who had saved them, and he made the offer that would change all their lives forever. "All four of you," he said quietly, his gaze including Ayanna in his promise. "Come on in." The Henderson brothers, Jake and Moses, crested the nearby hill just as Miller's posse disappeared over the horizon. They were good men, honest ranchers who judged a person by their character, not the color of their skin, but even their open minds were about to be tested. "Having some trouble, Boone?" Jake called out, his eyes quickly taking in the strange scene. Boone Carter, a woman who was clearly Apache, 3 small white children, and the lingering tension of a confrontation that had just ended. "Depends on how you want to look at it," Boone answered carefully. Moses swung down from his horse, his gaze falling on Ayanna. He respectfully removed his hat, a simple gesture of courtesy that spoke volumes. "Ma'am," he said with a nod. "These are the Whitman children," Boone said, deciding there was no point in beating around the bush. "Tommy, Lily, and Samuel. They've been alive this whole time." The 2 brothers stared, their faces a mask of disbelief. They had been at the funeral. They had helped shovel dirt onto the empty coffins. They had mourned the loss of the entire family. That's impossible," Jake breathed. Morrison told us himself. No survivors. We searched the ruins. Morrison lied, Tommy said, his voice ringing with a startling clarity. He killed my parents. I saw him. The accusation landed with the force of a physical blow. Moses knelt, bringing himself eye to eye with the boy. Son, he said gently, that's a very serious thing you're saying. It's the truth. Tommy's voice didn't waver for a second. He shot Pa, then he shot Ma, then he burned our house down and left us to die in the cellar. Ayanna placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. I found them 3 days later. They were half-starved, but they were alive. Jake looked deeply troubled. But why? Why would Morrison want to kill Jonathan Whitman? They were neighbors. They attended the same church. Because of what my pa found, Tommy explained. Papers, hidden in our cellar, about a man named Fletcher buying up land cheap after families got scared off by Apache raids. But the raids, they were fake. The pieces clicked together in Moses's mind with an audible snap. Fletcher. That's Morrison's cousin from back east. He's been buying up half the valley for pennies on the dollar this last year. Buying it cheap because Morrison has been manufacturing a panic, Boone added. Running folks off their land with phony raids so Fletcher can swoop in. And when Jonathan Whitman found the proof, Jake finished, his voice grim, he and his entire family had to be silenced. Samuel, the youngest, who had been silent and clinging to Ayanna's leg, suddenly spoke, his small voice cutting through the heavy air. The man with the star, he shot Mama while she was praying. The simple, devastating testimony of a 4-year-old was more powerful than any legal document. It was the unvarnished truth. Moses stood up slowly, his face hardening like granite. What do you need from us, Boone? Safe passage, Boone said immediately. To Fort Randall. Colonel Hayes needs to hear this. Morrison has been operating with federal authority to handle the Apache problem. If Hayes finds out he's been murdering white families as part of a land grab, Morrison won't let you get within 10 miles of Fort Randall, Jake warned. He'll have men on every trail watching for you. Then we won't take the main trails. Ayanna looked at Boone, surprised by his use of the word we. All 4 of you, he said, meeting her gaze. You're my responsibility now. I meant what I said. The weight of that promise settled over them all. Boone Carter, a man who had ridden alone for 15 years, was now the sworn protector of an Apache woman and 3 orphans, standing against a corrupt sheriff and his private army. There's something else, Moses said, his voice low. Morrison isn't just worried about testimony anymore. Word is Fletcher himself is coming to town next week. He's here to finalize the biggest land purchase of all. Jake's eyes went wide with understanding. The entire Henderson Valley, our land, everyone's land, every family that's been scared into selling cheap. Tommy looked up at Boone, his young face filled with a desperate, fragile hope. Can you really stop them? Before Boone could answer, Lily tugged on Ayanna's dress, her little hand pointing toward the horizon. More riders, she whispered, coming fast. This time, there were at least 6 of them, and they were closing the distance at a gallop. But as they drew closer, Boone's blood ran cold for a different reason. These weren't Morrison's thugs. He recognized the lead horse, a distinctive paint mare, a horse that belonged to Colonel Hayes himself. It's the military, Moses said, a wave of relief in his voice. Blue uniforms. But Boone felt no relief. He felt a new, colder dread. If Colonel Hayes was riding out here personally, it could only mean one thing. Morrison had gotten to him first, and he had told his version of the story. The column of soldiers pulled up 50 yards from the cabin. Colonel Hayes rode forward alone, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Behind him, 5 cavalry troopers sat motionless on their horses, their hands resting on their rifles. Mr. Carter, Hayes said, his voice formal and cold. Colonel, Boone responded, stepping forward, positioning himself between the soldiers and the family he had just sworn to protect. What brings you out this way? Sheriff Morrison rode into Fort Randall an hour ago, Hayes said, his eyes hard. He had some disturbing reports. He claims you've assaulted his deputies. He claims you're harboring an Apache woman wanted for raids. And he claims you've abducted 3 children. Tommy started to speak, to shout the truth, but Ayanna's hand on his arm, gentle but firm, stopped him. She had lived a lifetime of seeing her people's words dismissed by men in authority. Colonel, that's not what happened here, Jake Henderson interrupted, stepping forward. These are the Whitman children. We can vouch for them. Hayes's gaze shifted, studying the 3 young faces. Sheriff Morrison showed me their death certificates, signed by Dr. Patterson. Patterson was paid off, Moses said, his voice thick with anger. Just like half the other officials in this territory. That is a very serious accusation, Mr. Henderson. It's a very serious situation, Colonel, Boone replied, his voice calm and even. These children watched Sheriff Morrison murder their parents in cold blood. They've been hiding for their lives ever since, because they know he will kill them to keep them silent. Hayes dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He walked slowly toward Tommy. The boy stood his ground, meeting the colonel's intense gaze with a courage that was astounding. Son, Hayes said, his voice a little softer now. Do you know who I am? You're Colonel Hayes, Tommy said. My pa said you were an honest man. Your father was a good judge of character. Now I want you to tell me exactly what you saw the night your family died. Tommy took a deep breath, and for the second time that day, he told his horrific story. But this time, he remembered more details. The names of the deputies Morrison had with him, the specific words the sheriff had used about making it look like an Apache raid, the conversation he'd overheard between Morrison and one of his men about Fletcher's land purchases, and how this was the last piece of the puzzle. As Tommy spoke, the hard mask on Colonel Hayes's face began to crack. His expression grew darker and darker with every word. When the boy finished, the colonel was silent for a long, heavy moment. These are federal crimes, he said at last, his voice a low growl. Murder, conspiracy to commit fraud. If what this boy says is true, Morrison has been running a criminal empire under the cover of his badge. It is true, Lily said suddenly. Her small voice cut through the tension like a knife. The bad man with the star shot Mama, and then he laughed. The simple, innocent testimony of a 6-year-old girl seemed to land harder than anything else. Hayes looked from the girl to Ayanna. Ma'am, he said, his tone now filled with respect. How did you come to be with them? I heard them crying, Ayanna said simply. They were trapped in the root cellar. I dug them out. I have been protecting them ever since. At great risk to yourself. Children, she replied, are worth any risk. Hayes nodded, a look of profound approval on his face. Then he turned back to Boone, his expression a mixture of respect and grave concern. Mr. Carter, Morrison has issued a warrant for your arrest. He's claiming you assaulted his deputies and are harboring fugitives. He has also requested federal authority to organize a manhunt. The net was tightening around them. He's gathering men right now, Hayes continued. By nightfall, there will be 20 armed riders scouring this territory for you and these children. Samuel, who had been clutching Ayanna's hand, finally spoke up. Are the bad men going to hurt us again? He asked, his voice trembling. The question hung in the air, a heartbreaking challenge. Boone looked at the terrified little boy. He looked at Lily and Tommy. He looked at Ayanna, the woman who had risked everything. No, he said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. They are not. Hayes studied Boone's face, searching for something. What are you planning, Carter? Whatever it takes to get them to safety. Boone's hand moved unconsciously toward his gun. If that means going to war with Morrison and every man he can buy, then that's what it means. A slow, surprising smile spread across Colonel Hayes's face. It might not come to that, he said. You see, Morrison made one critical mistake when he came to me today. What was that? He assumed I was as corrupt as every other man in his pocket. He offered me a 10% cut of Fletcher's land deal if I'd use my federal authority to help him eliminate the witnesses. The implication hit Boone like a lightning strike. You have evidence. You have proof of the conspiracy. I have Sheriff Morrison's own words, Hayes confirmed, witnessed by my adjutant. It's enough to arrest him for treason and conspiracy to commit murder. He paused, letting the news sink in, then delivered the twist that changed everything. But first, I need to get these children someplace safe. Someplace Morrison and his money can never, ever reach them. Where? Ayanna asked, her voice filled with a hope she hadn't dared to feel for weeks. Colonel Hayes looked directly at her, his eyes filled with a respect that no man of his position had ever shown her. My wife and I, he said slowly, have been hoping for a family for many years. We have a large house at the fort. There's a good school, and there's the United States Army to protect them. The offer was staggering. It was more than any of them could have ever dreamed of. But before a single word of acceptance could be spoken, one of Hayes's troopers shouted a warning from the ridge. Colonel, riders approaching from the south, at least 15 of them, and they're flying Morrison's colors. Morrison had found them, and this time he wasn't sending his deputies. He was bringing an army. Morrison's men fanned out, forming a wide, menacing semicircle around the small cabin. Their rifles were drawn, their faces grim. The corrupt sheriff sat at the center of the line, his face a purple mask of rage, and beside him, on an expensive bay mare, sat a well-dressed man from back east, a man who looked entirely out of place in this rugged land. It had to be Fletcher. Colonel Hayes, Morrison bellowed, his voice dripping with false deference. I am surprised to find a man of your stature harboring wanted criminals. Hayes urged his horse forward, his posture radiating military authority. The only criminal I see here is you, Sheriff. Or perhaps I should say, former sheriff. What in the hell is that supposed to mean? Hayes calmly pulled a folded document from inside his jacket. As of this moment, by order of the territorial governor and the authority of the United States Army, you are relieved of your duties. James Morrison, you are under federal arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason. Morrison's face went from purple to a ghostly white. You can't do this. I have authority in this county. You had authority, Hayes corrected him coldly. Authority you abused to murder innocent families for your cousin's illegal land scheme? Yes, Mr. Fletcher. I know all about your part in this, too. Fletcher attempted to maintain his composure, but beads of sweat were popping out on his forehead. Colonel, I assure you there has been a grave misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Boone interjected, his voice carrying across the clearing, was you thinking you could get away with it. Tommy stepped forward then, pulling away from Ayanna's protective grip. The 8-year-old boy looked directly at the man who had destroyed his world. I remember your voice, Tommy said, loud and clear. You're the one who told them to make it look like Apache raiders did it, but I saw you. You shot my pa yourself while he was trying to protect my ma. You lying little... Morrison started to snarl, but Hayes cut him off. The boy's testimony, the colonel announced for all to hear, corroborates the evidence I have already gathered, including your personal offer to bribe a federal officer to help you murder these witnesses. A nervous murmur rippled through Morrison's line of hired guns. They had signed on to chase Apaches and bring in a fugitive. They had not signed on to become part of a federal conspiracy to murder children. Boys! Jake Henderson shouted from beside Boone. You might want to think long and hard about who you're really working for. Morrison has been using you to terrorize his own neighbors. If he can do it to the Whitmans, He can do it to any of you! Several of Morrison's men exchanged uneasy looks. Moses Henderson was right. No family in the territory was safe if the law itself was the biggest threat. "Don't you listen to them!" Morrison screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "They're trying to turn you against me!" But his authority was dissolving like sugar in the rain. One by one, then two by two, his men began to lower their rifles, holstering their weapons, and slowly backing their horses away from the line. Fletcher saw the tide turning and made a desperate attempt to save himself. "Sheriff Morrison was acting entirely without my knowledge," he declared. "I had no idea about any of this." "Shut your mouth, you coward!" Morrison shrieked. "You think you can throw me to the wolves and walk away?" The panic in his voice confirmed everything. Fletcher's face went ashen as he realized his cousin was about to drag him down with him. Colonel Hayes raised his voice, his command ringing with absolute authority. "All men loyal to the law of this territory will step aside now. Anyone who continues to stand with Morrison will be considered an enemy of the United States government and will be treated as such." That was all the encouragement the remaining hired guns needed. Within seconds, Morrison found himself utterly alone, facing down Colonel Hayes's soldiers, Boone Carter, and the Henderson brothers, with only Fletcher and two terrified deputies at his side. "It's over, Morrison," Boone said quietly. "Give it up." Morrison's hand twitched, his eyes darting toward his gun, but he stopped. Boone wasn't even touching his own weapon, yet there was a certainty in the cowboy's eyes, a promise of swift and final justice that made the sheriff's blood run cold. "You think you've won?" Morrison snarled, a cornered rat spitting defiance. "Even if you arrest me, Fletcher has enough money to buy every judge in this territory." "Not every judge," Colonel Hayes replied with a grim smile. "Federal judges answer to Washington, not to local bribes." The trap was sprung. Morrison knew it. His wild eyes swept over the group, finally landing on the four people who had brought his empire crashing down around him. A lone cowboy, an Apache woman, and three small children who had found the courage to speak the truth. "This isn't finished," he growled, but the words were hollow, defeated. Then Samuel, who had been quiet through the entire standoff, spoke up in his innocent 4-year-old voice. "The bad man can't hurt us anymore?" The simple question from a child who had lost everything seemed to suck the very air from the clearing. Even some of Morrison's former men, watching from a distance, bowed their heads in shame. "No, little one," Ayanna said softly, pulling Samuel into a tight embrace. "The bad man can't hurt us anymore." But Morrison had one last desperate move to make. His hand flashed down to his gun. It was a fool's play, a final act of rage. But before his fingers could even touch the handle, Boone's Colt was in his hand, aimed squarely at Morrison's heart. "Don't," Boone said. The speed of the draw was blinding. Morrison froze, his hand hovering over his gun. All around him, the cavalry soldiers had their rifles leveled, the metallic clicks of hammers being cocked echoing in the sudden silence. "James Morrison," Colonel Hayes announced, his voice booming with finality. "You and your associates are under arrest. Surrender your weapons. Immediately." There was no way out. Morrison slowly, reluctantly, raised his hands into the air. His deputies and a pale, trembling Fletcher did the same. The nightmare was over. As the soldiers moved in to place them in shackles, Tommy walked right up to the man who had murdered his parents. The 8-year-old looked up at the defeated sheriff, his eyes holding no hatred, only a quiet, solemn justice. "My pa always told me that bad choices have a way of catching up to a man," Tommy said, his voice steady. He was right. Morrison stared down at the small boy he had tried so hard to erase from the world, and perhaps for the first time, he saw the true cost of his greed. But it was far, far too late for regret. 2 hours later, Morrison and Fletcher were locked in the back of a military wagon, on their way to a federal trial they could not buy their way out of. The Henderson brothers were riding through the valley, spreading the news that the reign of terror was over. Boone stood outside the cabin, watching as Ayanna helped the children gather their few meager belongings. Colonel Hayes had made his offer official. All 4 of them were invited to live at Fort Randall as his family. "You did a good thing today, Carter," Hayes said, coming to stand beside him. "Those children would be dead if it weren't for you." "They saved themselves," Boone replied. "All I did was give them the chance to tell their story." "Well, my wife is going to spoil them rotten," Hayes said with a smile. "She's already planning their bedrooms. Tommy is sharp as a tack, and the little ones will blossom with some real care." Boone nodded, surprised by the sudden tightness in his own throat. For 15 years he had ridden alone, and the thought of saying goodbye to this strange little family was harder than he could have imagined. "What about Ayanna?" he asked. "Some folks at the fort, they might not understand." "Some folks are fools," Hayes said bluntly. "My wife will only see a woman who risked her own life to save 3 orphans. That's exactly the kind of person we want in our family." Just then, Tommy appeared in the doorway, holding a small, lumpy bundle tied with twine. "Mr. Boone?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Are you coming with us?" The question hung in the air. Boone had spent his entire adult life avoiding attachments, convincing himself that solitude was strength. But looking at Tommy's hopeful face, at Lily peeking out from behind Ayanna's skirt, at little Samuel who had started calling him Papa Boone, he realized that his old life now felt impossibly empty. "Well," Boone said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "if the colonel doesn't mind one more mouth to feed." Hayes grinned. "I think we can manage." Ayanna emerged from the cabin with Lily and Samuel. Her dark eyes met Boone's, and in them he saw it all: gratitude, respect, and the beginning of a partnership built on something stronger than blood. "Ready?" she asked. Boone took one last look around the clearing, at the small, forgotten cabin where everything had changed. He had come here a lone rider, and he was leaving as something else. He was leaving as part of a family bound together by choice, courage, and commitment. "All 4 of us," he said, echoing the words that had started it all. "We're ready." As they rode toward the setting sun and Fort Randall, Tommy chattered excitedly about going to a real school. Lily hummed a small, happy tune to herself, and Samuel fell fast asleep, his small head resting against Boone's chest. Ayanna rode beside him, no longer a fugitive, but a mother with a safe future for her children. Boone Carter had spent 15 years running from the world. Now, for the first time, he was riding towards it. The lone cowboy had discovered that true strength wasn't found in riding alone, but in choosing to ride together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the Old West. And if you have a story about a time when a stranger did the right thing, share it in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these stories alive.